Hello everyone, welcome to the new episode of the EBA Consulting Podcast. Today we have with us Dr. Thomas Budd, who's a lecturer in airport planning and management and an academic lead for Passenger Experience Laboratory in the Center for Air Transport Management at Cranfield University. Thomas, thank you very much for joining us today to talk about the newly opened Digital Aviation Research and Technology Center, Passenger Experience, Aviation Sustainability, and Social Distancing and Safety Measures in Aviation.
Hi Hubert, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today.
And it's a pleasure to be able to host you. Before we dig deeper into our conversation, could you please tell us a little bit about your background? How long have you been involved in the aviation industry and how you got there as well?
Of course, yeah, absolutely. So I'm Thomas Budd. I'm a lecturer in airport planning and management in the Centre for Air Transport Management at Cranfield University in the UK. I'm the course director for our MSc programme in airport planning and management. I specialise in a number of different areas, some of which we will be touching on in our conversation, hopefully, around the environmental impacts of aviation and air transport, also issues of resilience and adaptation planning, but also increasingly, more recently, looking at issues around the passenger experience. And I'll hopefully talk about some of the work that we're doing around the passenger experience at Cranfield. I joined the university in 2014. So I originally joined as a teaching and research fellow, but then moved up to being a lecturer a year later. I have to admit that I am not you see academics and those working in aviation who said that they have always been, interested and fascinated in aviation and airports since they were 3 or 4 years old. I think my interest in airports and aviation came slightly later. My academic background is actually in physical geography. So I did my degree at a university called Durham University in the UK. I specialised in physical geography, looking particularly atmospheric science and climate change. And my dissertation looked at the environmental impacts of aviation on climate change. But at this stage, I was still very interested predominantly from a climate change perspective rather than an aviation perspective. But increasingly, I became more and more interested in the airport and aviation side of the sector. So following my undergraduate studies, I then undertook a PhD. So I went into PhD research straight away at Loughborough University, another university in the UK. And the project, it was a specified project concerning the environmental impacts of airport surface access, so the way that people travel to and from airports. The remit of the project was looking at how we can encourage, as operators, as decision makers, how we can encourage more environmentally sustainable decision making from passengers around how they travel to and from airports. So particularly how we can encourage, through a variety of mechanisms, sort of market-based measures, soft policy options, how we can encourage passengers to switch from using their private cars towards using public transport. And that was the remit of the project. And I think from then on, my sort of interest in the airport and aviation side of things was really cemented. Following my PhD, I worked at a university in Scotland, the University of Aberdeen, where I worked for 18 months as a teaching and research fellow, again looking at sustainable travel aspects. It wasn't specifically focused on aviation, but when I had the chance to join Cranfield, which, as many of your listeners will know, has a real heritage and pedigree and specialism in air transport and airport planning, I jumped at the opportunity. So I've been at Cranfield since 2014, and so I'm still there. So I think it shows that things are going well.
Absolutely. And thank you for all this information. I'm already excited for our conversation to learn your views, which you are bringing from a slightly different angle that we would normally have from the people from more of the inside of the aviation industry. And, combining that with the educational sides and all your background and experience and the environment, I know that it's going to be very relevant as well. Could you please tell us a little bit about your role in the Center for Air Transport Management at Cranfield, where, by the way, half of the EBA team as well got their own masters, and so as you said, a lot of listeners, they do know Cranfield, they can recognize this institution.
That is one of the great things about Cranfield, that our alumni are spread far and wide. I think that's inevitable in in the industry. So it's a bit of a running joke that we can go to any country on business, or if we're delivering a course or doing some research, pretty much anywhere in the world, put a message out onto LinkedIn, and there will be a Cranfield alumni group within that country who will be happy to come and share a drink with us on that evening. So it's that's definitely one of the benefits of Cranfield.
How very convenient as well.
It is convenient, yeah. In terms of my role, I think there are sort of two major aspects to the work. So the first major sort of role revolves around the fact that I'm the course director for the MSc in airport planning and management. So there's a variety of tasks that involves. Of course, there's the teaching element of that. So the face-to-face teaching of the modules themselves and the course, the supervision of students in their thesis and the work that they're doing, but also there's a great deal of course management as well. So there's sort of that angle to it. Related to that work, we also conduct our own research. So we will concurrently be working on research projects. Some of those will be internal projects that we have devised ourselves. Others will be projects that are funded. So they will be funded by a research council normally. So things like UKRI, Innovate UK funding, so from funding bodies, EPSRC, for example. So we will be working on those sorts of projects, but we also act and do quite a lot of work on a consultancy basis. So we will also be working at the same time on various private projects for individual clients as a traditional consultancy would. So it's it always makes me smile when people say that, you know, we must have really long holidays as academics because we must have the same holidays as the students, and that is absolutely not the case. When the students go home, that's when we start doing all the research and contract work that we haven't been able to do when we've been doing the teaching. So that's sort of one aspect of my job. The other main role, and one that has come about in the last 18 months or so, revolves around my role as an academic lead in a new facility, a new centre at Cranfield, which is our Digital Aviation Research and Technology Centre. So as part of that new facility, it's a new project that the university has received quite a considerable investment on. It's working with a number of different industry partners. It's a collaborative effort. But the project and the centre itself will focus on digital systems integration in air transport. So across the university, we have a variety of capabilities around aerospace and technology integration more generally. So things like new airframe designs, propulsion systems and things like that. This Dartech is more around the digital systems element to that. The area that I'm leading is called the seamless journey. And it is broadly concerned with how we can collectively, as an industry, how we can really try and facilitate safe, sustainable and seamless journeys using and utilizing disruptive digital technologies. So in terms of the different parts of that sort of seamless journey element, we're focusing on passengers. So we have a passenger experience laboratory. We are also focusing on the aircraft journey, and particularly the aircraft turnaround, and trying to make that more safe and more efficient. We are very lucky at Cranfield to have our own airport and our own aircraft. So we have a Boeing 737 aircraft, which we use for research and for teaching. So we will be using, as part of the Dartech building, a simulated gate at an airport with our 737, which we'll be using in a research and sort of test bed facility. So we also have our ground operations laboratory, which is obviously around the aircraft turnaround. And the third element to the seamless journey revolves around producing seamless journeys for cargo and for baggage. So we have our cargo and baggage lab, or cab lab, and we are looking at how things like new innovations in RFID tagging and things like that can be used in the context of cargo and baggage. So that work is very different from the work that I do in the centre generally. There's no sort of teaching or student face-to-face elements to it. It's more about developing research, developing capabilities, relationship building, and defining what the sort of work and research will look like in Dartech once it opens later in the year.
And can I ask you, what is the framework for Dartech? And what I mean by that would be primarily, who is it for? Are you working closely with some sort of aviation organizations and institutions, or are you more oriented towards business and individual clients, or is it purely academic research institution just trying to improve and then sort of push those ideas across the board with some other organizations in the form of guidelines and recommended standards and practices maybe?
I think the answer will be a bit of all of those things, to be honest. I think at Cranfield, generally, it's a university that has a fantastic reputation for its very close collaboration with industry. And certainly we have some big industry collaborators in Dartech. So Boeing, Thales, Avalent, and other quite large players in the industry are our partners, business partners in Dartech. So we obviously will be working very closely with them on projects that are of sort of mutually aligned in terms of the sort of strategic priorities of the industry and by association the companies involved. We intend that the outputs from Dartech will also have academic value as well. So it's not simply a vehicle for sort of private consultancy work. That might be that there may be an element of that, but that's not strictly what Dartech has been developed as. So I think the answer would be a bit of all of those things, but certainly, and this goes for all the work at Cranfield, that very close link with industry is absolutely paramount and will certainly be a key part of Dartech as it develops.
Thank you. And having only opened at the beginning of 2020, are you already full on working on any particular project and appreciating that it will be revolving around the seamless travel, as you already mentioned? Where are you now, if there is anything that you can give us a sneak peek into your daily work streams at the moment?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, happy to. I think we joke that one of the benefits of operating in a digital facility is that you don't need the physical building to actually start the work. So although the building is still under construction, the work streams and research in Dartech are well underway. So perhaps I can talk about two particular projects that we are, one that's already sort of, well, both are ongoing, I guess. The first project relates around work that we are doing in the passenger experience laboratory, looking at the use of XR. So we are using that term to explain extended reality technologies. So virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality technologies, because we feel that there is huge potential for these technologies in a variety of different contexts in aviation and air transport. The first project that we undertook in the passenger experience laboratory involved designing and then building a bespoke airport environment. So we designed the airport as one might do normally when designing a real airport, but the difference here was that we then, in collaboration with our partners at Thea Immersive, who are a specialist firm dealing in immersive tech, we built the airport in 3D. So the airport can be experienced in virtual reality, and we are using that asset to conduct experiments, essentially, particularly around user trials and user experiences in that space. The first aspect that we have looked at is around wayfinding, because we see that there is a great deal of potential for improvement for the way passengers experience and navigate through airports. This is clearly a mix of the sort of physical signs and physical signage that you see in airports, but there is also increasingly with new technology and technological advancements the potential for integration of personalized wayfinding. Things like augmented reality can be used to project onto the floor of a passenger terminal where a passenger needs to go for their gate, a more personalized journey. So we've been looking at how we can configure and reconfigure this virtual airport environment with a variety of different wayfinding configurations, because one of the beauties of using virtual reality is that you can very quickly and very easily and very cost effectively completely change the configuration of an airport or any other asset for that matter. Something that would be very difficult, almost impossible to do in a real environment, you can make those changes pretty much in real time in virtual reality and have people physically go through that experience in virtual reality and see how they behave, see where they go, see where they look look. So we can use eye tracking technology to see if people are looking where we would expect them to want them to in a wayfinding context. We can see how different types of passengers experience the environment and how they travel through the airport. So that's one example. And we've been particularly looking at that in the context of improving the journey for passengers with additional needs. So we have taken an approach that philosophically, if we can improve the passenger experience and the door-to-door journey for passengers with additional needs, that will have trickle down and filter down benefits for the general passenger demographic. So just to give an example, we've been looking two main areas, particularly around the needs of passengers who have unseen disabilities. So for passengers who require wheelchair, we know, PRM provision is fairly standardized and generally relatively good across the industry. But there are, I think, considerable room for improvement for how passengers with unseen disabilities are handled and addressed. So we've been looking at passengers with Alzheimer's and dementia, and that is one area which is very relevant in a wayfinding context, because as you'll know, people with Alzheimer's, their wayfinding and navigation is one of the first symptoms of their condition. So we've been looking at how this is reflected in an airport wayfinding context, but also alongside that, the challenges faced by passengers with visual impairment. So what we can do in VR is simulate the difficulties that these passengers face. So to simplify it, putting filters over the VR experience to show what it is like for passengers who have age-related macular degeneration or cataracts or are extremely colorblind or short-sighted. We can simulate that relatively easily in virtual reality. The reason we have been doing that, certainly in the case of the work with visual impairment, is around demonstrating that to staff and people who are in passenger-facing roles at airports and airlines, so cabin crew. And we can really use that as a tool to develop empathy and awareness around these conditions. So we can put people in other people's shoes, essentially, and say, this is what it's like for passengers boarding your aircraft with these conditions. And often it's quite, I would say, quite eye-opening as to some of the challenges that these people face. So that's sort of one area of work that we are looking at. We are also using that technology for an ongoing project looking at conceptualized designs for the future aircraft cabin. So we were approached by the organisers of the Aircraft Interiors Expo, which was due to be held in Hamburg earlier this year. Unfortunately, it was cancelled, along with pretty much every other conference and event for obvious reasons. But they wanted us to conceptualize what the future sort of technological capabilities of the future aircraft cabin would look like. So we defined a report and then built in VR a sort of a 360 experience of what the future cabin would look like and the various technologies and capabilities that cabin could have. So that's sort of one area of the work in the passenger experience lab, which it's really exciting, and I'm really learning a great deal about virtual reality and augmented reality and everything that goes with that. I think there's a huge amount of potential in that sector.
I'm really jealous now, and I absolutely love this concept of passenger experience laboratory, because as you said, effectively you can simulate, and obviously professionally I'm very close to the simulation and building models which revolve around mainly the processes and changes to them potentially through isolation of individual or multiple variables, and we can tackle in this way really multi-dimensional problems as well. But with what you said, how you apply this mixed or cross reality really and overlay it, taking into account the passenger experience, it just makes me think that this is something potentially that could be paired together. So we can just bring it under a single umbrella of testing and simulating different processes, but also combining that with the very passenger experience. And I think that with that being on the upward trend and gaining significance across the industry is definitely a way to go. And I'm just excited about this possibility and now learning that it's already happening to such an extent.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there is huge potential and huge excitement here. I think the project that we have defined and described so far is a standalone piece of work. But of course, when you start integrating additional sources of data, whether that's sort of prevailing flight schedules at an airport, for example, what you are essentially doing there is building a sort of real life 3D digital twin of an airport. essentially. And that's when you can start simulating things like passenger flows, delays, and so on. So you can start integrating additional sources of data collected from a variety of different sources, add that into your model, and essentially that is a very compelling and powerful tool, I think. So the work that we are currently doing, that isn't the limit of this technology. I think this is the starting point of that, and I'm really excited to see how sort of the merging of these different technologies work together to really come up with something quite, I think game changing is not an overstatement, I think.
I totally agree with this one. And also, maybe coming back a little bit to the point of the wayfinding itself, this is just another thing which is so relevant and will be critical right now, where airports need to adapt to the social distancing, which we'll touch on in more detail slightly later as a sort of standalone discussion topic. However, what you said, I think it just opens my eyes on what is available and possible to test this new reality that we do not really know what it's gonna bring and what it's gonna mean for our passengers. So having this ability to simulate it and overlay it together with the passenger experience, it really sounds like an amazing opportunity to try and encapsulate that within the airport strategy as well, where we need to create it safe, but also as good of an experience as possible. And just something that I remembered really is from my personal experience when I was involved in one of the wayfinding projects. Only then I realized how difficult it is to create something appealing or suitable from the passenger point of view if you actually happen to work at an airport and you know it well and you just take it for granted that you would know where to go, how to proceed, and how to move around it. And you are just so biased and affected that you can miss so many things and not even think about it, that then our passengers, they face on a daily basis. And it could be a struggle as well. And something that you also said about hidden disabilities, and something that more and more awareness is being brought to as well, the anxiety, especially at airport environment, which is so busy and bustling with loads of people, and it can be a stressful experience as well. I'm already thinking about the vast, number of opportunities that you can improve the airport environment with that.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. I think one of the beauties, again, of VR and this type of technology is that you can test changes, you can test interventions before they are implemented in real life. So you could alter your wayfinding, you could try something different in terms of your internal configuration or your lighting or your ambient sounds, whatever that might be, and test that and experience it in VR before you have to implement it in your terminal for real. By that stage, if your intervention doesn't work and you've already implemented it in your terminal, it's too late. But in VR, you can test that at pretty minimal cost and in a safe way, in a way that isn't going to impact the passenger experience for real. So I think that's, as a sort of decision making and planning tool, I think that has real benefits. And you are absolutely right in terms of things like wayfinding. I mean, it's kind of assumed knowledge for people who have traveled by air regularly. The sort of the flows, how to behave, how to experience an airport. But I mean, for markets, I mean, this is pre-COVID-19, I would like to say as a caveat, but for markets like India and China and places where a lot of people are traveling, in some cases they're flying they're flying for the very first time. They have never flown before, and air travel has been more accessible than it has ever been. This is obviously prior to COVID-19, but these people, it's not always straightforward how to experience and navigate your way through an airport, and this is where I think this kind of approach can have real value.
Absolutely. And it also brings me to another question, maybe in a slightly wider sense, really. What are currently, from your point of view, the challenges as well the opportunities? And I think one of that you already covered for the airport planning in the future.
So I think there are a number of challenges. It's an extremely challenging time for the industry generally, I think, at the moment. Certainly, and this is a challenge that I think certainly preceded COVID-19 and the challenges that the pandemic has created, and I think will continue to be a challenge, will be around aviation's environmental impacts and how as an industry, we will be able to effectively to tackle that and instill confidence in society and in policy and in political circles that the real change is being implemented. And this isn't so much, it is a moral issue. I think there is a moral demand for air transport to address its environmental externalities, but also it's a business issue. I think we talk about environmental sustainability being a license to grow, essentially. So the airlines, the airport operators, the manufacturers, whoever that might be, those who will be successful in years to come will be those who are able to effectively demonstrate and mitigate their impact on emissions, their impact on local air quality, on noise impacts for local communities, for minimizing waste, for using renewable sources of energy, or minimizing water and waste usage. So I think that is a prevailing challenge and one that I think will remain. I think what's interesting in the last year or so is that we are now seeing, whether you want to call it the Greta effect or what, I think we are seeing a shift in public opinion. And I think whereas in the past, perhaps consumer behaviour and societal opinion towards aviation's environmental impacts was not as high as it would be for things like in a domestic context. I think increasingly that will be the case for aviation. We're seeing examples now. In Sweden, they're seeing their domestic air travel has dropped significantly year on year. I think that is possibly something that we will see mirrored in other markets as well. And that may be reflected in changes in consumer behaviour and priorities, whether that's around the number of flights that they take a year, or the destinations that they travel to, or frequency of travel, or whatever. But I think that environmental sustainability piece is fundamental. So I don't think that will be going away anytime soon. Of course, we can't talk about challenges without talking about the current situation and the impact that the global pandemic is having and will continue to have for the sector. Of course, air transport has sustained significant shocks in the past, 9/11 or the SARS epidemic, but I think it's the general consensus and generally agreed that this is different. And I think the impacts of what we are seeing at the moment will be profound. I don't think anyone knows exactly what it will look like in the future, but I think it's agreed that things will be different, whatever that might be. So I think in the short term, we will see sort of the more immediate changes and things being implemented in airports, how airlines are operated. We've seen things from Ryanair in the last couple of days around how they will be operating flights, and things like not allowed to queue for the bathroom on the aircraft and things like that. So there'll be all these sorts of changes. But I think in the longer term, there will be more sort of profound structural and design changes to how the sector operates. And of course, there is that huge question about what the recovery will look like. Will demand for air travel pick up again after countries start to reopen? And if so, when and how quickly? I think that is a huge question mark that I don't think currently anyone really truly knows the answer to. So I think it would be challenging to address these kind of changes in a normal environment, but in an environment where time is of the essence and we are quite likely to be seeing an economic downturn, whether that's the same or as on the same scale as the sort of 2008, 2009 global recession, potentially even worse than that. So we might be having to make significant changes in an environment where there isn't a lot of demand for air travel and there isn't a lot of money going around. So I think that's a really difficult situation for aviation. I think it is fair to say that this is entirely unprecedented.
Thank you very much for listening to the first part of this episode. Check back with us next week and tune in for part 2. Together with Dr. Thomas Budd, we will continue to talk about sustainability in aviation and also social distancing and aviation safety. Thank you for your attention and all of your support. Until next week.